I'd like to welcome you all to this session that we hope will be both enjoyable and useful. I'm Mike Jones. I'm one of a cast of characters, along with some of the other rogues on the stage that helped create something called OpenID Connect over a decade ago. It finished as final specifications in February. And we're having 3 different celebration events for this. We had one in Japan at the OpenID Foundation Japan conference in January. We have this one. And next week we're doing one in Europe as well. And each of us is going to give a little bit of our personal perspective on what we achieved, how we got there, and what we might want to learn from it. So here we go. So we finished these specs unbelievably in 2014, a decade ago. OAuth 2 finished in 2012. And so I will talk, as I said, about how we got there and hopefully what we can take away from it that's applicable to current systems that we're trying to build and deploy. So, a little bit of history. In 2010, we started to work on something called an artifact binding for OpenID 2.0, which was a then existing protocol. And those of you who know SAML know what an artifact binding is. Those of you who don't, it doesn't matter, because we eventually just supplanted it. But at the same time, developers were voting with their feet. They did not want to use XML and XML canonicalization and all of that. They wanted to build JSON REST things with APIs, and that was starting to take off. And so we pivoted and decided to instead create OpenID Connect as an identity layer on top of OAuth 2.0. And we talked about this many times at the Internet Identity Workshop in California. In May 2011, we decided to call the thing OpenID Connect. We did 5 rounds of interop testing between 2011 and 2013. Sometimes at those tables at the Computer History Museum, sometimes online. We eventually built up test suites. And the early developer feedback was priceless. And I will say that it was fitting that we held the first celebration in Japan, because there were a number of early Japanese implementations from Mixi, Yahoo Japan, other things, where developers jumped in and built it before it was done. And then they told us what they thought. So we have a design philosophy that I think served us well. Keep simple things simple. That's easy to say. You have to keep it foremost in your mind when you're actually designing features. Now, at the same time, sometimes you need complex things, and they should be possible, but not at the expense of keeping things simple. And we actually had a real test that we would apply as we were designing a new feature. There's a friend of ours and a prolific Ruby developer in Japan, Nov Mataki. And we would ask ourselves as we designed something, would Nov like this? Would he put it into his implementation? And could he do it in a few hours? If it met those criteria, it passed the Nov Mataki test. And Nov was one of the people on stage with us in Japan. I think this is well known, but there was very broad participation in what became OpenID Connect. This is by no means a complete list of the participants, but all of these companies, consortia, individuals, and many more contributed ideas that eventually became part of OpenID Connect. Now, we did have extensive knowledge of some things that had come before, including SAML. And we were not too ashamed to borrow stuff. So there were things that already worked well. So for instance, the notion of having metadata to describe the endpoints, the notion of having authentication contexts, we lifted directly from SAML too. But at the same time, we added new things in OpenID Connect that weren't present in SAML and weren't present in OpenID 2.0. Maybe most importantly, support for native applications, support for encrypted claims, which are used in some of the higher assurance situations, and something which people ridiculed us for at the time, which was signed requests. That actually worked out well. So I've always believed that successful systems are going to have to be able to adapt and grow as they're deployed and in the marketplace and to fit new use cases. And we have a mechanism both in OAuth and in Connect that served us really well. We always say when we have a list of 3 or 5 values, other values may be defined and used. Furthermore, any values that you don't understand, you must ignore. Well, why does that matter? That means that you can add a new feature and not have it break existing code if the code follows this principle correctly. And indeed, many successful OpenID Connect and OAuth specifications have been created using this principle. I mean, we didn't have logout at the beginning. We didn't have the identity assurance claims, many, many other things. We tried to build it using modular components so that you could build the ones that you need and omit those that you don't. Among other the components that we created contemporaneously with Connect were JSON Web Signature and encryption, the key format, the JSON Web Token, which is the basis of the ID token. So this worked out much better than I would have ever imagined. We developed what, by most counts, is now the most widely deployed and used identity protocol on the internet. There's thousands of interoperable implementations in every conceivable language. There's a certification program which helps make everything more secure and interoperable for implementations that participate in it. And we're even on a path pretty soon to have ISO republish the specs as ISO standards. Why does that matter? Because it turns out that there's jurisdictions, countries around the world, that there's a legal requirement to use national treaty organization specs, meaning ISO or ITU, in preference to anything else. So we're not changing anything, but this will help many countries around the world also decide to use OpenID Connect. You're certainly using it. You probably used it today. Nobody put an OpenID Connect brand up in front of you, but if you signed into your Google phone apps or Apple apps, or heck, I learned that AT&T was supporting OpenID Connect when I went to pay my DirecTV bill, and I saw the URLs up in the top, and I thought, oh, that's familiar. So what have we learned? History's great, but if it informs the present and the future, that's even better. Developers choose things that are simple. And developer choice is critical to adoption. Interoperability and security require rigorous testing. And we, again, borrowed from SAML's playbook to develop a certification program so that interoperable and secure deployments could become the norm. Now we tweaked that, and you do the tests yourself, and there's many differences, but testing and certification are key to having working ecosystems. I've already talked about extensibility. I think that's proven to have been critical. And let's talk about the people. Deployments of our identity systems have to be easy to use and hopefully compelling for people to use for them to decide to use them. I and sometimes John and Chuck worked on a previous system called InfoCards where we did blind user studies and fewer than 3% of the subjects got through the initial flow because they didn't understand what they were trying to do, what it did, why they would want to do it. And even the successful subjects, when we were done, they would say, well, how could I have logged in? I didn't type a password. So
that was one of its stealth privacy-preserving features.
So, unless we build systems that are easy to use, they won't get used. Now, there's unintended consequences of that. Not everything worked out the way we thought that it would. So, for instance, we designed the identity provider discovery mechanism so that you had total user choice, like you did in OpenID 2.0. That we expected that people would type URLs or email addresses of the identifiers they wanted to use to log in with. And indeed, that's buildable, and some people built it. But what really happened was NASCAR screens. You get, 3 or 5 buttons. Sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, sign in with Microsoft, sign in with Twitter, most of which use a variant of OpenID Connect. Now the new sign in with Apple is also an OpenID Connect flow. Why did that happen? It happened because sites measured the user acceptance and how many got through the flow, and they tried to optimize that. So, not everything works out the way you planned. But, all in all, I'll take the level of success we had. And if I could say, anything in closing, it's that if you're designing a new system and a new ecosystem, listen to your developers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. And I switched off now. Cool. Hey, everybody. My name's Chuck Mortimer. I am responsible for consumer identity products at the Walt Disney Company. Probably heard of us. You know us as Disney, I presume. You also might know us as ABC or Marvel or Star Wars or Hulu or FX. Like, it kind of goes on and on and on, which makes it a fascinating place to work on identity. We are both simultaneously trying to convince consumers that they can use their identity for buying princess dresses and McGregor cage match fights. So it is an interesting place to work on it. We are also currently implementing, I think, our second OpenID Connect implementation. This one we're doing this is our scale one for real, so it's exciting to be here 10 years and kind of wading through the muck of the problems we've created for ourselves. I am going to actually look back, though. Lots of things happened in 10 years. I wasn't at Disney. I was actually at Salesforce at the time. I was, I think, fortunate enough to work at a company who was going through a large growth spurt in the enterprise space, and they enabled me to go work on standards as part of kind of my side job, if you will. And I think, in retrospect, that's really what I brought to the equation, maybe, was not exclusively. There were other voices, but we brought the voice of Salesforce and its customers and the ability to deploy that in our ecosystems and use it in enterprise use cases to really bring the enterprise voice to the standards process. It's also been 10 years, and I had no idea what I was thinking at the time, so I cheated, and I've actually just used Gmail to look at what I was talking about at the time. So I've pulled up my slides from 2011 when I was talking about the transition into OpenID Connect and what was going on for the enterprise at the time, and I'm going to attempt to look at that. I think what I discovered was that I was really good at writing esoteric slides. I think I'd been hanging around Dick Hart too much, and I had a bunch of weird one-word slides. So you're going to see me kind of like try and figure out what was going on in my mind. So the first thing I was talking about, or the main point of this talk was like, does OpenID Connect work for the enterprise? And very quickly, my conclusion was no, it doesn't work. Sorry, does OpenID work for the enterprise? And my conclusion was no, not in current form. And then I start making the case for OpenID Connect and some of the changes that we're going to bring about and why that's important for the enterprise and why this is going to work better. The first thing, you already heard Mike talk a bit about this, but one of the things we were really trying to hammer home was simplicity. Remember this 2010 to 2014, cloud and SaaS are not a foregone conclusion. We still get objections like on a daily basis from customers that are trying to take the enterprise and wrap it around cloud and SaaS and figure out what to do with this and whether they were going to even adopt. So we're getting a lot of complex requirements coming out of the enterprise. We're trying to convince them that despite the fact that they are not asking for it, cloud is the path to, and SaaS is the path to simplicity, and the surface area we need to expose from that needs to be simple. So looking back, like I think a couple of core things I was talking about, you heard Mike talk a little bit about this, but canonicalization is hard. Again, if you don't know what this is, that's probably because it's hard and some SDKs take care of it for you. It's essentially trying to get the bytes in the right order such that signatures that are important for the security of the messages that are being sent come out in a deterministic way. The signature can be produced on both sides. Cool. Super hard in XML. Pretty hard in OpenID because we were doing it with HTTP parameters. Ultimately, I think what we decided was we need to throw this out. Developer simplicity is going to win the day. And at the same time, made the bet that HTTPS was going to take over and that we really needed to get everyone onto a secure substrate and let the data flow over the lower level encrypted channels. The other thing we were getting a lot of was like, hey, implement WS star, either the whole thing, weird parts of it. No offense to anybody who worked on WS star in the room. I know there are people here for sure. It did not meet our simplicity requirements. We were arguably competitive with Microsoft. It just was not what we wanted from a posture perspective. And we certainly didn't want to be propagating this further. So what we think, like looking back, what I think happened is a couple of things. One, WS star was replaced. And I mean replaced pretty specifically here because if you look at the standard stacks we have now, almost all of what was in WS star was actually directionally correct, and the patterns are still there. They're just implemented with this simplicity overlay there. The other thing that happened as the standards expand, they try and build more and more complex things in. You hear Mike say we got ridiculed for doing signed requests. It was ahead of its time, that was all. So one of the things we looked at the time was we need to build the flywheel. We need to get this going. So we implemented something called the Basic Implementers Draft, which took OpenID Connect Core and brought it down to just enough for a pretty solid basic single sign-on use case to get that flywheel moving. That helped build adoption. People could implement. We could do easy interop testing without doing this big implementation. And the specs gain velocity, and then the more complex features can be adopted by the people who need them once the ecosystem is kicked in. You'll also notice that I seem to have developed a really bad anti-pattern for using asterisks all the way because I had the no asterisk, the simplicity asterisk, and this. So, and WS star has a lot of asterisks. So next up, it starts to get really esoteric. I've got a couple in here. OAuth based for data services. So thinking about what I was probably getting at, iPhones are starting to eat the enterprise. So, and this is changing where we're deploying applications. Applications are starting to move around, and enterprises are trying to figure out how to get control over all of this. So they're asking us for fine-grained control and additional policy over our applications. And then they're also asking, like, we need to be able to authenticate to these things, so we need to be able to federate with them. Again, we don't want to implement WS star for federation. For the mobile apps, we're looking for simplicity. So looking back, I think a couple of key things happened here. One, we take the patterns from SAML and metadata and OAuth and metadata and replay these. And at large, what you now see in the industry are basically application frameworks. Like the large cloud providers all have directories of applications where we either know the application or you can register an application. And what we're really doing here is adding in the important context of it's not Bob authenticating to a service, but it's Bob authenticating to a service in the context of this particular application, which allows us to apply policy, control data access, and be very fine-grained how we treat that. That then manifests in the specs as a lot of people look at these as consumer specs and you have to have that consent page. What we did in the enterprise then is move that to, this can actually be driven by the back end. You can authorize the application with groups or roles or dynamic policy or conditionally change the scope of that based upon the shape of their device and the trust of it. But the real key thing here is the metadata for this application and understanding the context in these application frameworks. The other thing that we did was popularize the use of embedded web views for logging into mobile apps. People did not like this from an experience perspective initially, but what this allowed us to do was leverage web single sign-on in the mobile context, i.e. we could start out in OAuth and OpenID Connect from a provider or mobile app and basically chain federation protocols together. So you could start out speaking OAuth, switch to the corporate SAML IDP, come on back and switch back to OAuth. So we launched this pattern for the Salesforce mobile apps. It is predominantly the pattern used for like mobile SSO today. So I think the standards enabled that. I then have this really weird one talking about artifact profiles. I think Mike said you don't need to know what this is. The simple case for this is you're passing over a little opaque string such that all of the important data can be securely transferred between services on the back end rather than passing that through clients. This didn't work super well with SAML when you moved to the cloud because what happened is there were firewalls everywhere. So if I look back on this, like what happened was you get into this integration pattern where the enterprise would want to use an artifact profile in SAML and you would get to talk to the firewall people at an enterprise over and over and over again in order to get them to open up a hole for the callback from the cloud. So
sort of surprisingly enough, our requests by artifact has made a recovery in financial services, etc. So now it's the banks that are saying, yeah, we really want that. So we now have JARM and various other things.
Well, and I'd argue authorization code is an artifact profile,
Right.
basically.
Yeah,
But what we're really making the case for here is the firewall's moving around and losing importance. And we can make this bet on authorization code and this profile such that we can securely move the data on the back end rather than moving it through the front end. What this then allows is like applications just start to get built in new ways. We can also start to authenticate and secure the traffic. We then pick up the properties of, because we're doing this on OAuth, we also get a token in it. So we can now do callbacks to the enterprise, and as that firewall goes away, it's not just callback for the SSO message, but we can call back for other data services and begin to build hybrid applications. What we then saw was applications started to be composite of data that existed in the cloud, data that existed in the enterprise, data that existed in other services. Really getting the SSO token, or giving SSO the ability to access tokens, to access data services was pretty key. I then get to this weird one where I say one of the values is claims centric. I'm digging here for what I was thinking at the time, but one of the key things was that the way people were starting to adopt cloud was it was kind of just in time. We're either just getting a business unit or there were fundamentally companies like retail companies where they didn't know who was going to need to access the service and they just needed to grant access on the fly. I was pretty convinced this would work. In 2007, we'd worked with Ping Identity at a different company to kind of popularize SAML JIT, and I found that pattern worked well, send attributes over and create the user just in time during federation, but it was really expensive to get the mapping done. So you had to, like, with each customer, again, integrate, map this, figure out how to get the claims into the SAML assertion, map it over. And I found myself really missing LDAP and its standardized schema and the ability to hit a directory service. So one of the things that really appealed to us in OpenID Connect was the user info endpoint and a standard schema for users. We then found this pattern worked really well for just-in-time creating users, both in an enterprise context and in all of the regular marketing contexts or like consumer contexts where OpenID Connect would get used. And this led us to also realize that just-in-time didn't work in a lot of cases and led us to invest in the SCIM standard from there, which was really like, okay, how do we simplify directory enablement? I then finally get into this really weird section that I had to squint at for a while, but I was basically making the case for why does OpenID not work? And the first one was users don't really identify with URLs. If you remember OpenID, there was this thing where you could paste in your URL. It would go discover where you wanted to log in. So it was building this discovery process of like, how do you figure out where a user wants to log in?
He's talking about OpenID 2.0.
Yes. Yeah. What we also found was that realistically, consumers make brand decisions or trust decisions based upon brand. So you see the emergence of NASCAR and all of these buttons everywhere, which is like, okay, you're not going to use a URL, just tell us whether you want to use AOL, or tell us whether you want to use Yahoo, or tell us whether you want to use et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't scale, and it leads to a scenario where like the large OPs, the large identity providers, just win because the economies of scale force everybody into it. So I have this then janky like long tail diagram. Long tails were very popular at the time. And this is what we were supposed to get with OpenID 2.0, which was like all of these different, everyone could run their own OpenID provider. But this is what we really got, because this is how the economics of centralization and discovery really drove user behavior. But this is what the enterprise was asking us for, which is we actually want this one like IDP over here, which handles our 100 users. Okay. And then I start making the case of, well, this is what the enterprise actually wants. They actually wanted that full set of like, we can get claims from anywhere, because if you look at this, enterprises are big, complex ecosystems, and one identity provider is not enough. What we quickly found is they had geographic identity providers, business units that didn't get along, partner identity providers, and employee identity providers, and one just didn't work. The other thing that I think I was going for was like this presentation of claims piece. I'd worked on info cards, I'd worked on user-centric identity and the kind of OpenID manifestations of it. It was not taking off, but I still believed in the pattern. I think retrospectively what we actually saw was a whole bunch of the scale, the IDP problem gets solved because these things do move out from outside of the firewall, and they consolidate into big cloud identity providers for the enterprises, the Oktas, the Azures, like all of the different providers that emerge for that, which take the scaling problem of integrating with each of the individual enterprise IDPs, make it knowable, make it addressable, firm documentation, automatable, like you can really scale the process. We also see new types of discovery emerge over the 10 years. So we move from NASCAR to tenant-based discovery, type in the name of your enterprise tenant, type in the URL where your enterprise tenant is, to then Google really introducing and making the pattern of splitting the username box and the password box apart from each other to do username-based discovery. So we get a lot of new discovery patterns. And then finally, I think user-centric ultimately morphs into SSI and is still trying to find its momentum as an ecosystem and its deployment patterns. So I think that's my takeaway here. If we're trying to look back retrospectively, my hope is that in 10 years, this user-centric and claim-centric pattern does find its way, and we can see that ecosystem flourish, and that some other set of actors, hopefully some of you out in the audience are up here on stage giving us a 10-year look back on how you made that successful. Hopefully we inspired you, and I will turn it over to Nat.
So a lot of what I'm going to talk about has already been covered, but I came up with a title, 25 Years of OpenID. Here we are talking about 10 years of OpenID Connect, but why do I have 25 years? Many of you probably don't know the history. So OpenID is commonly known to have started back in, I forgot the year, but 2005 with OpenID 1.0, which was created by Brad Fitzpatrick, right? And it was based on a blog address. And that's where, the OpenID 2, type in your blog address kind of, URL kind of things came along as well.
Brad was working for Blogger at the time, so there was a touch of self-interest there.
Yeah, sure. And then that quickly turned to OpenID 2.0 back in 2007. But before that, OpenID.net actually existed back in 2001. How many of you knew about that? Probably none, right? And it was created by a guy called David Len, who is now working for Digital Bazaar. And he's still working on identity stuff, by the way. And the site, the time, looked like this. It had 3 links. The SourceForge project, that was open source stuff, which is, I think, now defunct, kind of. And then the .gnu. So that SourceForge project was created using .gnu. And then there's a link in XNS.org. And if you click on the SourceForge project, it came up like that. I took this from the webarchive.org. And it was saying that to share information associated with a particular user, group, account, etc. between sites on the internet. Which is just what OpenID Connect does, actually. And also, if you go back to XNS.org, that actually existed back in 1999, and that's 25 years ago. And that XNS.org thing was working on the protocol which was later called XRI, which became the discovery protocol for OpenID 2.0. So that's why I'm saying that it's the 25th year of OpenID.
So that eventually became DIDS. But
Yes. I was almost submitting a talk about DID and its history, but...
As I said, things don't always work out how you think they will.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so, and in the meantime, there are a few things happened, like, do you guys remember Hailstorm? And, yeah, you do, right? Hailstorm and Microsoft Passport. And as a kind of you're working on that, right?
I was in a different group then, but
okay,
as I came into Identity in 2005, Kim Cameron made sure I understood what had happened and what the lessons were from that experience.
Liberty Alliance.
That's right,
Yes.
freedom
So
from Microsoft.
I was going to that, Liberty Alliance, and they came up with a, did I put it? Yep, SAML 1.0 back in 2002, which became SAML 2.0 in 2005. And it's declared as, thinking of wearing a T-shirt with a, I shot the SAML T-shirts, but it's still alive.
I only have one, so I just wore it on Tuesday.
Yeah. So that's how it happened, and then we developed in parallel to that we developed OpenID 2.0, and then shortly after that, back in 2007, if I remember correctly, that was December 4th or something like that at IIW, OAuth 1.0 was declared, done, and OpenID AX, Attribute Exchange, which was led by Dick Hart. Mike Jones and me was also one of the contributors to that, was developed there. And on 2008, we came up with something called OpenID TX, later became CX, Contract Exchange, which is about signing the request, which Mike Jones talked about a little while ago, which was not very popular at the time, but at the end of the day, it became request object, and then the return back was also signed and to become FAPI later. Let's get back to 2007. So 2007 was an important year in the history of information technology. We had this great device called iPhone came out, right? And in 2008, even more important thing, App Store and API ecosystem came along, right? And that meant that we are going to have gazillions of untrusted apps that you didn't want to share password with. And giving password to those unknown apps was inherently a bad idea. Very bad idea. So what we needed at the time was the audience identity and minimum access authorization, which translated into ID token and access token. And that's what it is for OpenID Connect, by the way. But we could, we thought of using SAML OpenID authentication to the low and OAuth 1.0 for that, but it had its problems, and it was too brittle. The canonicalization didn't work, and so on and so forth, and also the payload was too big for the then very narrow radio wire capabilities. So we came up with something called OpenID AB, standing for Artifact Binding, which is now the OpenID Connect Working Group's formal name is still Artifact Binding Working Group, by the way. So three of us, me, John, and Breno Madeiros, who isn't here, unfortunately, sat down at IIW, a corner of IIW, and started designing what we can do. And quickly, the Ryo Ito, who was working for Yahoo Japan at the time, Japan was big on the feature phone, mobile ecosystem at the time, and this was a very acute problem for them. And then, Hideki Nara, who's working on the similar space, came along, and we sat down on the design decisions. And I remember I also talked to you at the time about those design decisions, and we came up with the no canonicalization, ASCII armoring, JSON, and REST as the design decisions at the time. But that meant that we didn't have any signature scheme for JSON at the time. So we came up with JSON simple signature and encryption. And at the same time, two Googlers, Doug Belfont and John Panzer, was working on a parallel work called Magic Signature and JSON Token. And I forgot the name, Jolan Golan.
Yaron Galan.
Yeah, Golan was also working on a similar thing. And
At Microsoft.
yeah, at Microsoft. And then there came Dr. Mike Jones, said, you guys are working on very similar thing, and you guys should come together and standardize it at IETF. My initial feedback was, that's going to take time. That's going to be too much work. And then he said, don't worry, I can get all the editing done and so on and so forth. So we decided, all right, if you're up to that, do
So
it.
Facebook was also working on a similar thing and was originally originally part of it.
Yeah. So we came up with JWX, like Mike Jones just talked a few moments ago. JWS, JW, JWT, JWA, JWK, and all those things. So that we have JWX there. But there was another problem. So using OAuth 1.0 or something similar as a substrate was one of the options, but then it had its own signature mechanism based on canonicalization again. And that was
Of the HTTP
Oh,
messages,
yeah.
which developers never got the same.
and that was defeating the purpose. And then there came two guys, Dick Hart and Alan Tom, with something called OAuthWrap. Do you guys remember OAuthWrap? Probably not.
Web Resource Authentication Pro.
Yes, a few people, which later became OAuth 2.0. So, and OAuth 2.0 was published in 2012, and we reached a final version of OpenID AB, which was then, which has adopted the marketing name of OpenID Connect in between, and we published OpenID Connect 1.0 in 2014. So that was the brief history of OpenID Connect. And what we have achieved is the ID token JWX Auth 2.0 HTTPS-based protocol that defines for a client how to request for the server to provide the ID token and the claims, which is perfectly fit for modern identity and access control framework, like this is ABAC system. We were thinking of the ABAC at the time. So, and works for the enterprises, but not only the enterprises, but in the social logins like you have right now, signing with Apple, signing in with Google, and logging with Facebook, as well as national identity schemes. All those countries in Europe, as well as many countries in Asia, and some countries in Latin America are also adopting OpenID Connect as their national identity system. And it's the basis for FAPI, which is sprawling all over the market. Like, it started off in UK, but then went to Australia and Brazil, and now we are talking about US and Canada, things like that, for the open banking, open finance thing. So, how we achieved? It's repeat. It's going to be a repeat, so I'll be very brief, but we listened to the developer feedback, solved what was not solved, no canonicalization, that's simple for simple use cases, and security and privacy facilities. And what lessons we have learned could apply to other initiatives, like new initiatives, like VC related stuff as well, and learn from history, make it simple to read, simple to implement for the minimum viable case, and find the developer pain and solve it. So that's what we can learn from it. So that's me.
Now, Chuck's going to advance my slides. So I have followed these guys in the past and realized that there were probably limitations to the 100 slides that I wanted to present. So this is my version of automation. So I'm John Bradley. I thought he would look more like Vanna White, but each to their own. So we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So my thesis is OpenID. SAML. It's about the SAML specification. Like, standards organizations tend to get obsessed and emotionally attached to the things that they develop, and I have a long rant about the nature of standards organizations and how they become self-fulfilling and creatures of their staff. One of the big differences is, fundamentally that we started this as a community effort, and it's a bit of anarchy. Well, actually, probably a lot of anarchy, come to think of it. We've always run the organization, the OpenID Foundation, very lean. We've had, for most of the time, we only had one staff person, simply, and did everything through volunteers. We've also, as you've seen, we've changed from a very simple, how do I use my blog site to log in and make a comment on somebody else's blog site and still get an attribution idea, to now, we've moved to be based on top of OAuth now. We're we're being used as part of the verifiable credentials ecosystem for national IDs in Europe, etc. So I'm spending a lot of my time working with the large-scale pilots in Europe to roll out, global EID systems. So one of the important things is to not be afraid of throwing away stuff that eventually, doesn't suit your purpose. We have to listen to the audience. One of the differences between IETF and the OpenID Foundation, there's a lot of similarities, but IETF, there's never been a conformance suite for OAuth. IETF can't like market its way out of a wet paper bag. I mean, some people may not even know what IETF is. I mean, almost everything relies on IETF standards, but it's a meritocracy. Nobody actually takes responsibility for promoting anything. So one of the things that we've been able to do by having, we develop stuff that we then want to get out to a broader audience. So we have a habit of taking our standards and actually putting them in other standards organizations to get broader adoption. So a lot of things that are OAuth specs in IETF actually started off as OpenID working documents. So we're not emotionally attached to our specifications as much as other people are. We're happy to move them off into other standards organizations if that makes more sense. We work with more of the standards organizations. We have, we're developing stuff with W3C right now around moving the OpenID for VP request API into a JavaScript interface in the browser so that we can improve security and interoperability. And Haresh in the back there, if you want to ask questions about it, he's actually working for it on the Android team. So we have a lot of sort of continuing innovation, some specifications, like OpenID 2 and some bits and pieces, have dropped off, but we're continually developing new things based on, what do people need? We get requirements and we sit down and figure out, well, how can we actually satisfy those requirements as opposed to necessarily we have a specification, let's try and fit every problem to it. So we have sort of organizationally, we're a bit different than some of the other things. And I think that's mostly the point, is that there, OpenID is what you want to make of it, and everybody should, the OpenID Foundation is free for anyone to participate in. Anyone can join our working groups and help contribute to the specifications. There's no cost. Yes, but obviously you could also give us money too if you really want it, but that isn't a requirement. There is an IPR. So we actually, one of the things that early on we did was said, well, how do we actually get big players and small players to all participate in this stuff on a fair basis without making the IPR overhead so burdensome that companies can't join? So companies like IBM, Microsoft, etc., they have boatloads of patents. They have everything in the world patented. They don't even know what patents they have. So asking them to sign a document saying they won't exercise their, that they're going to sign over a particular patent, etc. Once you get their patent lawyers looking at anything, it becomes a hopeless nightmare. So what we did was what I described as mutual assured destruction IPR agreement. So basically the IPR agreement said everybody who participates in developing the specs or is a foundation member who signs off on the specifications, you don't have to disclose your patents, but if anybody ever asserts their patents over anybody who's implemented our specifications, everybody else is going to gang up on them and sue the shit out of them. So if
That's not the legal language.
So they had lawyers paraphrase, basically there are marketing departments and lawyers that have to abstract anything that I say. But so essentially it's the way to the community that enforces the IPR policy. If you were to be a small player that wanted to sneak something in and get your stuff, get royalties off of it, which nobody has succeeded in doing, but the downside to that is that all of those patents that you don't know about that you may have violated, all of the OpenID Foundation players are going to look in their patent portfolio and find everything that they haven't enforced on you, and you're going to be looking at serious money. So it's sort of the mutual assured destruction theory in my mind, and that's actually worked pretty well for us. Other organizations have a lot of different in IETF. You are supposed to disclose if you know somebody who has a relative who might have a patent, but that doesn't necessarily stop anybody from, Certicom has filed threatened patent enforcement against half of the IETF specifications I've ever written. They're just that kind of folks. So we have exactly 0 minutes. So why don't we go to audience questions?
Yeah, but maybe the message there is come contribute.
Yes.
And there are there are 4 authors on this stage, but this, as you saw, was built on the shoulders of years of other specifications that built in. And I think the acknowledgments is 30 people in the spec. So a lot of people worked on this. We're just the best looking for. So, yeah. So thank you for everyone who contributed.
Do we actually have time for questions?
Anybody got a question?
Anybody with no lives, nothing better to do? Questions? Sure.
Given that half the standards are in IETF and some in OpenID Foundation, how do you decide what goes where?
I don't know. Consensus. We have.
Generally speaking, when we think that it is more useful to the wider community than just identity, then we tend to bring it to the IETF.
Right. So quite often IETF hasn't historically had a focus on identity standards. So a lot of times we develop something at a higher level, and then the individual components that aren't specified, like some of the metadata stuff, etc. So things that are more generally applicable that aren't necessarily as identity focused, we wind up moving over into IETF.
Indeed, there's a whole bunch of OAuth specs that started as OpenID specifications, and then we subsetted them. So for instance, the OAuth authorization server metadata spec is a subset of OpenID Connect Discovery, and so it goes.
So looking back at the history, okay, so SAML 2.0 came out and the working group is no longer around. What about OpenID Connect? Are we going to continue on, or there will be a point that we're done?
Hopefully there's a point where we're done, where or at least those of us on stage can retire and pass it off to other people. But there will probably be new things like OpenID 2 became OpenID Connect. There will be new identity, there'll be new requirements, new standards will be developed, and maybe at some point OpenID Connect itself, the core standard, would be retired. But I don't know when that's going to happen. Yeah, SAML has kind of petered out. I also have an Internet 2 and SAML hat, but the interest in part of the problem is that there's no new way for the SAML vendors to wring money out of their customers. Sort of, just as a product, nobody's was really interested in developing it. It's sort of like it's already feature complete. You're just selling extra fuzzy dice for the dashboard at some point. So it was better for the companies like Ping and Okta and this is OpenID Connect. It's cool, new, shiny. I can sell you additional features, etc. So there were market features, forces. It also, W3C lost interest in XML DSIG and encryption, and it's the post-quantum apocalypse that will finally wipe out SAML, because nobody actually has a post-quantum migration story. It doesn't exist. And everybody's kind of in research and education as well. We're going to move to OpenID Connect or verifiable credentials or something else, because our SAML implementations won't be secure one day.
And I think I'll flip it around real quickly, which is I don't think we want the working groups to end. It's as long as the world's going to keep changing, and as long as there are people who are interested in with new cases, use cases, those people will come forward and bring those new use cases and bring them to working groups, create new working groups, find a place in the existing one, and keep the momentum going. If you see that stop, it means the standard is dying and something else is emerging. So I'm not really hoping the working groups ever shut down. I hope they keep evolving and OpenID keeps flourishing. So.
Yeah, the verifiable credential protocol working group actually was spun out of OpenID Connect working group. So things we curate, and so it's very much active still.
One more? Or
There's 2 calls a week for
John,
people who
what's
want to
your
participate.
Federation talk? Do you want to advertise that?
No, don't come to my Federation talk. It'll be really, really boring. Nobody wants to use the F word anymore.
Thanks for spending time with us, everybody.
Yeah.